Now we're going to look at some deeper brain structures, things that you cannot see on the surface. You kind of have to cut open the brain in order to see these things. The first thing we're going to look at is the thalamus, right? So earlier we mentioned that the brain is going to have gray matter on the outside, and you can see that the cerebral cortex here is darker in color, and that's the gray matter. And typically on the inside is mostly white matter. So we have the corpus callosum and all the white matter associated with it in the hemispheres. But there are some exceptions. The thalamus is one such exception. The thalamus is actually gray matter, even though it's located on the interior of the brain. And in this frontal section of the brain, you can see that there is one thalamus, and then there is the other thalamus. Okay, so the thalamus is actually located on the lateral side of your third ventricle. Right? If you remember the flow of CSF, here are the lateral ventricles, and then they will go into the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is flanked by the two thalami that you have on each side. Now that creates a little bit of a strange problem. If we go to this diagram, you might remember seeing this slide before. If you look at this structure here, right, there is the third ventricle. Right, this label says third ventricle, but then this pointer says it's thalamus. So it's a little bit confusing, right? But if you think about it as a box, okay, so if you think about like an empty box, the empty space in front of the backboard here, that's basically your third ventricle, and the actual cardboard at the back, that would be the thalamus, because the thalamus makes up the wall of the third ventricle, right? So if I just put on a 2D diagram, if I just put an arrow here, it's kind of hard to tell whether I'm pointing at the space of the box or whether I'm pointing at the cardboard at the back, right? So if I were pointing at the space in front, then the answer would be the third ventricle. If I were pointing at the back space, then the answer would be the thalamus, right? So don't worry about that, because the labeling on the test are going to be quite clear, and you won't run into these kind of problems. Okay. To identify the thalamus, though, it's quite easy. If you just look at the corpus callosum, underneath is the lateral ventricle, and then beneath that you will see an oval shape with a little circle in the middle. That is going to be your thalamus. Here is another view of the thalamus. If I go to the 3D model, this is a coronal section, a frontal cut of the brain, and you're looking at the back half, and you can see again we have the gray matter for the cerebral cortex, white matter on the inside, but the thalamus here, they are gray matter as well. So you have the right thalamus, you have the left thalamus, and in between, this is where the third ventricle is going to be. Okay, so try to play around with this a little bit on your own. Again, I will provide the link online on eCentennial, and that will help you understand the relationship between various structures a little bit better. So what is the function of the thalamus? It basically serves as a relay center for all the sensory input except for smell. So visual information, auditory information, as well as somatosensory information are going to arrive at the thalamus, and it's going to get sorted and filtered before it is projected to the correct regions of the brain. So if you have visual information coming in from the eyes, it will first go through the thalamus, and then it will get projected to the occipital lobe. If you have auditory information coming in from the ear, it will get sorted by the thalamus, and then it will get sent to the temporal lobe. So not everything that comes in through our senses are going to be processed by the brain. A lot of it is actually filtered at the thalamus. So we go back to that example of where you are studying in the cafeteria, and you know, initially you might hear people talking and chattering in the background, but as you focus on your studying, you will eventually not hear the people in the background anymore, and that's an example of how your thalamus is able to filter out things that are not important for you at the moment, right? So our brain can concentrate on what's important, and we're not going to have sensory overload. Okay, so again, it filters all these information except for smell. Okay, smell, because of the location of the nose and the temporal lobe, smell can go directly to the temporal lobe without going through the thalamus. So below the thalamus is something called the hypothalamus. If you think about the third ventricle again, the left and right side of the third ventricles are going to be flanked by the two thalami, and the bottom of it is going to be where the hypothalamus is. Right, so in this picture you can see that's your oval with the circle in the middle. That's how you can always tell is the thalamus. And below that there is a little sort of triangle looking shape, trapezoid looking shape, and that is the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, right? So it's literally below the thalamus. So you have two thalami but only one hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is called the master gland of the body. It uses hormones to help you maintain homeostasis, and it regulates autonomic functions like hunger, sleep, thirst, body temperature, as well as water balance, to name a few. In fact, the hypothalamus works with another gland that's below it, and that's called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is separated into posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary gland. So together, the hypothalamus, along with these pituitary glands, are going to use hormones to control many processes in the body to maintain homeostasis, and we're going to learn a lot more about them in lecture 12. If we take a look at this diagram, the mid-sagittal section of the brain, we can again see the corpus callosum, and then that's the lateral ventricle, and over here that's going to be your thalamus, and the space in front of it is the third ventricle, and underneath that, this is where the hypothalamus is going to be. Right? And kind of dangling from the hypothalamus is going to be your pituitary gland. There's the anterior pituitary gland at the front, and there is the posterior pituitary gland at the back. Okay, and again, the hypothalamus and the pituitary works together, and using hormones, they help maintain homeostasis. Next, we're going to look at the brainstem. The brainstem has three parts to it. There is the midbrain here, midbrain. Below the midbrain is the pons, and then below that is the medulla oblongata. Right? So the midbrain is kind of directly below the thalamus, and the pons is in front, anterior to the fourth ventricle, and the medulla oblongata is the most inferior part of the brain before it exits the skull and transition into the spinal cord. Okay, so these three things, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, it makes up your brainstem. Okay, so the brainstem actually have overlapping functions, right? And they kind of work together to carry out these things. These overlapping functions, that is. And another thing to notice is that there are these cranial nerves that are emerging from the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And a lot of these cranial nerves are going to be involved in various types of cranial reflexes. The midbrains and the pons, they act as relay station for tracks that are passing between the cerebrum and the spinal cord or the cerebellum, and they also contains reflex center for visual, auditory, and tactile response. So an example of a visual or auditory reflex is if you are just studying in a quiet room, and all of a sudden you hear a loud bang. All right, your head might look up and turn towards the source of the sound. Right, that is an example of an auditory reflex. If you're driving on the highway at night and then you see flashing lights on the opposite lane, you might be tempted to look. Right, and if you do look, then that would be an example of a visual reflex. Okay. And the lowest part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. We learned about the medulla oblongata first in lecture 4 in the respiratory system. We know it controls your breathing rhythm, but it also controls things like heartbeat strength. There are also several reflex centers located in the medulla oblongata, and these reflex centers control things like swallowing, coughing, vomiting, and sneezing. When you take a cough syrup, the codeine, which is the active ingredient in a lot of cough syrups, actually targets the coughing center in the medulla oblongata to help suppress the coughing. 90% of the tracks cross the midline within the medulla oblongata, and that's why the right half of the brain controls the left side of the body, and vice versa. Going through the brainstem is a web of gray matter called the reticular formation. The reticular formation will gather sensory stimuli, including sound, sight, and touch, and use these stimuli to keep us mentally alert. Right? It will send these signals throughout the various portions of the cerebrum, and we'll use that to keep us mentally aroused and to know what's going on in our surrounding. And the reticular formation will continue to function even though when we are sleeping. If you are sleeping and then you hear your baby crying in the next room or something, you might jolt awake and go see what happens, right? That's an example of how the reticular formation is working, right? Even at a subconscious level, when you're sleeping, it's still gathering senses from the surrounding, and if the stimuli is strong enough, it will wake you up, right? It will cause you to become mentally alert again. So understandably, if you damage the reticular formation, it could result in a coma where you are not going to be able to be woken up, so to speak, right? You're going to be not going to be able to have that mental alertness. Next, we're going to look at the cerebellum. Cerebellum lies at the back of the brain here, and you can see it's just behind the fourth ventricle. Right? You can see the triangle here. That's the fourth ventricle. Here is the pons, and below that would be the medulla oblongata, and then you can see that there is the cerebral aqueduct. I think it's a good practice in general to just try to label everything you can whenever you see a new brain diagram. This will help you practice knowing where things are, and it makes the labeling much easier. So the cerebellum is densely packed with neurons. In fact, you have more neuronal connections in the cerebellum alone than the rest of the brain combined. The function of the cerebellum, we're going to separate it into three major functions. The first one is maintain balance and posture. Right? So you can kind of read this description yourself, but basically what it means is through signals from various sensory input, your cerebellum will be able to determine the present position of your body parts. Okay, so the cerebellum has an idea of what your body parts should be, where your body parts should be at, and what they should be doing when you are engaging in certain activities. So for example, if you're walking, then your cerebellum knows that you're supposed to be in this particular position. So if the sensory input tells the cerebellum that your body falls out from this position, say you trip on a pebble and now you are falling, okay, and you're falling, and then your hands are up, and then your legs are kind of all over the place, right? And you're falling, then the sensory inputs from the eyes, joints, muscles will tell the cerebellum that the body parts are no longer in the expected position, okay? And so the cerebellum will help you regain balance by sending motor impulses or motor signals, basically, through the brainstem to your skeletal muscle, and you will regain the balance, okay? So most of the time it works, and if the body is too out of equilibrium, then the cerebellum cannot readjust, and you will ultimately fall. But for the most part, right, the cerebellum knows what your body is supposed to look like when you are, standing, sitting, lying down, and if you get out of that position, it will help you regain your balance. Okay, and for posture, just by sitting there, your muscle needs to prop you up so that you don't slump over due to gravity. So the cerebellum helps you maintain the muscle tone in those muscles related to sitting, to help you retain your posture. The next function is to coordinate muscle movements. All right. The best way to think about this is if you want to do a ballet dance, for example. It's a very complicated series of steps, and it involves shifting your balance and moving your hands and legs in the right time in the right place, and all that requires a lot of coordination. And so the cerebellum helps you make sure you can execute those movements in a smooth, coordinated, voluntary movements. Okay, it's not just dancing, right? If you take something as simple as walking, right? You have to know when to lift your right leg, and then when to swing your arm forwards and retain the balance, and all that things happen so naturally to us that we don't think about it. And behind all that movement is actually the cerebellum, ensuring that you are able to produce smooth, coordinated, voluntary movement. Having said that, if you damage your cerebellum, then you will no longer be able to have these smooth, coordinated movements. The person would be stumbling around, and often people describe their movement as if they're drunk. Okay, there's a lack of coordination, and things can be a little bit jerky. So that's the second function of the cerebellum. And the last function of the cerebellum is to store skill memories. Okay, so skill memories are different from factual memories. Right, when you're studying for the test, for the exam, there's a lot of facts you have to memorize. That's stored in another part of the brain called the hippocampus. But for skill memories, things like typing, playing the piano, shooting a basketball, doing certain moves on a video game controller. All these things are going to be stored in the cerebellum, and these so-called skill memories or muscle memories are very, very resilient. Once you store it in the cerebellum, they're not going to go away for a very, very long time. Okay, so let's say you haven't ride a bike for 10 years, and I give you a bike, you probably can still ride it without any trouble. But if you don't study the anatomy notes for 10 months even, then you might forget a bulk of it, right? So skill memories are stored in the cerebellum, and they are very, very resilient. Next, we have the limbic system, which is a system that is related to survival. So through our experience, if we encounter things that enhance or decrease our survival, the limbic system will kind of remember these experience and use these experience to help make instinctive decision in the future. The limbic system is also the reward system of the brain. So when you do something that makes you feel good, it will activate the limbic system, and you would have a desire to do them again. Okay, so the kind of things that we do that makes us feel good include Eating, for example, right? If you eat a chocolate chip cookie, it feels good, right? So your limbic system lights up, and later on you might crave for another one. Okay, so that actually is related to survival, right? If you eat in general, you feel good, and then there's the desire to eat more later on when you're hungry, and of course, eating is part of survival. In modern days, there are a lot of other things that are going to light up our reward system, even though they might not necessarily be related to survival. So there are a lot of things that people can get addicted to, right? Smoking, for example, drug abuse, and even things like shopping or gaming, right? All these things is going to trigger the reward system, and it definitely plays a role in some of the addiction cases. So what is in the limbic system? Well, there are four parts here. We have the the hypothalamus rather, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the thalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus, that's where it will use hormones to influence the endocrine system, and these hormones might affect how memories are being processed, and by creating these memories, we can store them in the hippocampus. And how you feel about certain situations, the feelings that you get, the happiness, the anger, the frustration, right? Pleasant feelings, all those emotions are going to be processed by the amygdala. Okay, and finally, to process memories, we have the thalamus. So together they form the limbic system, and here is just to show you where some of the stuff are. You can recognize that this is the corpus callosum, and if you trace some of the fibers that are nearby, below it, you will see this is the hippocampus, and this is the amygdala. Don't worry too much about where things are for the limbic system. Just kind of know what the major parts are, and that would be sufficient. Lastly, we have different types of memories. We sort of mentioned this earlier in the cerebellum section, and the different types of memories are stored and brought to mind by different mechanisms. So we have skill memories. These are again repetition of motor tasks, and they are stored in the cerebellum. On the other hand, the decorative memories, these are facts and impressions, so like a formula, like a definition. These are going to involve the temporal lobe, right? And the inputs are going to be screened by the amygdala, and some of them are going to be sent to the hippocampus. So the ability to remember something actually has to it's connected to the amygdala. So, for example, if I ask you, what did you have for dinner last Wednesday, right? Take a moment and think about that. You might be able to remember, and for most of us, we won't remember. I don't remember what I ate last Wednesday. I don't even remember what I ate like yesterday night without thinking too much about it, right? And that's normal because it was just like like a regular Wednesday last week, and there was no special emotion associated with it. So your amygdala will screen those things out, so we won't remember it. But if I ask you, what did you eat for your last birthday, or for your last anniversary, right? You might remember it, right? You're likely going to remember that because it was hopefully a pleasant experience, right? So things that are pleasant, your amygdala will not filter it out, and you're more likely to remember it in your hippocampus. So that's why it's kind of hard to memorize the stuff that you're learning, in the course, because it's very unlikely that you feel pleasant, right, by all these information that you have to memorize. So it takes an effort to override the amygdala and kind of force these information into the hippocampus. So there are short-term memories, which holds few bits of information, like a phone number, words of a sentence, and you can hold them for like seconds or 2 hours, right? And usually, if you don't recite the short-term memory, they are going to be gone forever. Long-term memory will store larger chunks of information, and they are more or less permanent. If you recite these facts enough number of times, then they get stored in the long-term memory. And again, all these memories are going to be influenced by emotions, and sometimes if it involves epinephrine, something that is released during stress, then that might skip the short-term memory and put it in long-term memory. And that's it for the PowerPoints for this lecture. But before we end, let's go back to label one more brain diagram, so we have a more comprehensive views. So I took out a bunch of stuff that we didn't talk about, so we're not going to be responsible for it. So here, please go to the course pack, and we will label as many things as we can. You probably should try this out yourself first before you watch the video. But if you prefer to do it together, that's okay as well. So here, right, the easiest thing to identify in a cross section of a brain, that would be the corpus callosum. Okay, corpus callosum. It is white matter, and it will allow the two halves of the hemisphere to communicate with each other. Okay, corpus callosum. Over here, below the corpus callosum, that would be the lateral ventricle. And there's no label for it, so I'm just going to put it right there. And then here you see the circle thing you see the oval thing rather with the circle in the middle, and that is the thalamus. Okay, thalamus. In front of the thalamus, I should mention that, is the third ventricle. Thalamus. So the thalamus will filter all sensory information except for smell before sending it to the different parts of the brain. So again, if you have visual information coming in from the eye, it will go to the thalamus, and then it will filter it, and if it's worth sending forward, it will then get sent to the temporal lobe. Right? If you have to the occipital lobe rather. Okay? So if you touch some rough surface, that sensation of touching a rough texture is going to come up through the ascending tract. It's going to go to the thalamus, and then it's going to send it to the parietal lobe, where somatosensory informations are processed. Okay, so it will sort and relay sensory inputs from all over the body, except for smell. Okay. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. So that's this region right here. That is the hypothalamus. I'm gonna label this for you. The hypothalamus is C. Hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so this is below the thalamus. It forms the floor of the third ventricle, and it will work with the pituitary gland. Okay, pituitary gland is right here below the hypothalamus. Pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. So together, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland will maintain homeostasis through hormones. Okay. Now, in front of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, there is a structure here, and I know I said you don't have to know it, but I'm gonna put it here because it's gonna come in the next lecture. So there's a little spot here that is called the optic chiasma. And I'm going to explain to you what that means later, but just kind of know that it is in front of the junction between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay. B, you don't have to know, so we're going to go ahead and cross that out. What else can we label here? All right. Below the thalamus, you will have the first part of your brainstem. Okay, so that is the first part of the brainstem, and we call that the midbrain. Midbrain. Okay, and below that is another oval-looking structure right here. That is the pons. Okay, P for pons, and that actually means a bridge, right? And a bridge connects things together, right? So basically, the pons allows connection of various tracks that are going through from different parts of the brain. And below that, we have the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. Various reflex center there for swallowing, coughing, reflex, for example. And so the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, they form the brainstem. Okay, so I'm going to highlight them for you. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Right, these parts will form the brainstem. Okay, and of course, going through the brainstem is a web of gray matter called the reticular formation. It keeps us mentally alert. Over here, we see empty space. Okay, so this empty space forms like a triangle. That would be the fourth ventricle. Okay, it's going to be between the pons and this structure here at the back. Okay, so this here is M, and that is the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Okay, so three functions that we learned for the cerebellum: maintain posture and balance. It's able to allow the smooth execution of voluntary movement, right? So you're not going to have jerky movement. It's going to be seamless, smooth, coordinated movements. And the third function is to store skilled memories. Okay? On top of it, on top of the fourth ventricle over here, this one's kind of hard to see, but there's a duct here. And that is the cerebral aqueduct, and I believe it's J that's pointing to it. Cerebral aqueduct, and that connects the third ventricle that's in front of the thalamus to the fourth ventricle. Okay, don't think we have to know L here, so I'm going to cross that out. K is pointing at this lobe. Okay, so this, of course, is part of your occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is responsible for processing visual information. H is pointing at this lobe here. Okay, so that is your parietal lobe. Parietal lobe process somatosensory inputs, okay, sensations, right, from all throughout the body, right? Texture, pain, temperature, that kind of stuff. And G, do we have to know G? We don't have to know it. Okay, we don't have to know it for now. So we're gonna cross that out. We don't have to know I as well. Let's double check. Yep. So we're gonna cross that out. And here D is the pointing at the frontal lobe. Okay, so frontal lobe right here, frontal lobe. Okay, that's where all the complicated stuff is going to happen, including speech, voluntary movement, abstract thoughts, personality, and all that's going to happen in the frontal lobe. And on the left side of the frontal lobe, you are also going to have the Broca's area, which allows you to produce fluent, articulate speech. And that's it for this lecture. There are a lot of stuff to remember, a lot of stuff to learn. So please go through the rest of the study guide yourself, and we will talk more about it in one of the virtual sections. Thank you for watching.